off the heels of the LUMIX S1R Mark II, LUMIX have now just announced this, the LUMIX S1 Mark II, and although it looks exactly the same from the outside, it boasts a completely different sensor to what's in that previous camera. Instead of the sluggish 8K 44 megapixel sensor that was in the S1R Mark II, we now have a 6K 24 megapixel partially stacked sensor in this new S1R II. Now that's good news, especially for anyone who got a little bit upset about the rolling shutter performance on the S1R Mark II, because the partially stacked sensor vastly improves the sensor readout speed and rolling shutter performance. The launch price for the S1 Mark II will be £2,899 or $3,199, so really competitive pricing. LUMIX are claiming that this camera has 15 stops of dynamic range, that is with the return of dynamic range expansion mode. And if this is true, and when you consider all of the other features that they cram in here, like the return of Cropless IBIS, false color, 5.8K internal ProRes RAW, up to 60p 5.1K open gate, external ProRes RAW and B-RAW recording. The camera will also get ARRI log C via a paid firmware update. This could be one of the best mirrorless cameras for the price on the market right now. I was invited to the LUMIX launch event for this camera, but they haven't sponsored this video and they're not looking at anything before it goes out, or they haven't given me any talking points. But during that launch event, I did also sneak off and shoot an entire documentary with this camera with a local woodworking workshop. We're going to be looking at my experiences of shooting that documentary in this video as well, especially because it involved a lot of mixed lighting, a lot of high contrast scenes, so it really put this camera to the test. So we'll obviously do all the usual tests as well. We'll do some exposure tests and we will compare this camera to some of the previous models from the S1R Mark II and the S5 IIX. So if that sounds interesting, stick around and let's get into it. We've got a new sensor in this camera, and it's highly likely that this is the same sensor that we see in a camera like the Nikon Z6 Mark III. It's a 6K partially stacked 24 megapixel sensor. So as I was doing my research for this video, I watched a lot of videos on the Nikon Z6 Mark III. If it does share the same sensor, a lot of users were reporting issues with video on that in terms of flickering shadows and color shifts and stuff like that going on. And other people were worried that if the sensor was used in other cameras, that same thing would show up again. So I'm glad to report that it doesn't seem to be the case here. Even from sort of basic preliminary tests, you can see that this camera renders motion in a slightly more organic way than the S1R Mark II. Definitely has a boost in terms of dynamic range over the S1R Mark II. So I also brought the S1R Mark II with me to Lisbon. I had a few days there with Steph before the LUMIX launch. And, you know, like one of the things I've come to recognize of the S1R Mark II is that you really have to be careful with highlights on that camera. It clips quite low down in terms of IRE, around 80 IRE in Vlog. Like your exposure strategy with the S1R Mark II is that you tend to have to underexpose that camera to protect the highlights from clipping, and the clipping and the highlight roll-off can be a little harsh if you're not careful. That's not the story with this thing. It does seem to have a much more generous span of dynamic range. The ISO performance was fairly similar in terms of noise as the S1R Mark II, so pretty clean. We shot a lot of 100 frames a second, and that was about the only time I really saw significant noise creeping into the image. Let's take a real quick look at how the S1 Mark II compares color-wise and image-wise to the S1R Mark II and the S5 IIX. The S1R Mark II is much warmer. We saw that in a previous video, but it's not carried over to the S1 Mark II. And you can see how that really impacts the rendering of skin tones, especially in the shadows. S1R Mark II just produces a much warmer skin tone. I'd say the S1 Mark II much more neutral. And again, you can see here in the jumper, the saturation and density of red is much more intense on the S1 Mark II. And we can see this difference again in the way that they render these two lampshades. And here we're getting a hint of how these two cameras handle dynamic range. The S1R Mark II is clipping quite harshly and handling those highlights not as well as the S1 Mark II, which is not clipped and has a much more pleasing highlight roll-off. And then you can see all of these elements coming together when we have a look at the color chart. Pay attention to the white chip at the bottom, a lot more warmer on the S1R Mark II, and maybe the colors are a tad more saturated on the color chips as well. Let's look at the S5 IIX, and I'd say that these two cameras are much more closely aligned in terms of color, but there are some differences. The skin tone on the S1 Mark II just seems to have maybe a little bit more life. The problem with the S5 IIX, it can look a little bit waxy in skin tone sometimes, especially when you underexpose them. You can see some differences here on the red jumper. It's a little bit paler on the S1 Mark II. I'd say maybe a little bit more neutral perhaps. And again, on the lampshade, it's maybe a fraction more green or neutral on the S1 Mark II. I would say the highlight performance is similar, maybe a little bit more on the S1 Mark II, but within the same wheelhouse. And then again, looking at these curtains, maybe I detect a little bit more of a green tint in the S1 Mark II. Seeing this all together on the color chart, maybe the white chip on the S1 Mark II is a little bit more neutral and green, maybe a little bit warmer on the S5 IIX. And then here they are all together, and you can see maybe the red jumper shows the biggest difference and the color chart. As always, it's going to boil down to a bit of personal preference here, especially between these two newer cameras. You know, do you prefer the warmer rendering and the richer reds of the S1R Mark II, or do you want something a little bit more neutral in the S1 Mark II? It's early days, but I think I'm leaning towards the S1 Mark II over the S1R Mark II, but I do need to shoot a bit more of these to form a stronger opinion. So the native ISOs on the S1 Mark II are 640 for the low base and 5000 for the high base. The camera has a dynamic range boost mode, and that has a single ISO of 1000 where you get expanded dynamic range performance, and it works in all picture profiles across this camera. Now, interesting point of differentiation here between this camera and the S1R Mark II. So that also has a mode that expands dynamic range, and that's called dynamic range expansion mode. Kind of confusing that they're labeled slightly differently, but that's because although they achieve the same result, there's a slightly different process going on behind the scenes. So on the S1R Mark II, you can only use that in log. You get two native ISOs, and it's basically just running, I think, the sensor at a greater bit depth to capture additional information, you know, at the cost of rolling shutter. On the S1 Mark II, what you're doing here is you're getting this kind of like dual gain architecture coming into play, where it's combining the signal from the low base and the high base, and you're sort of jamming them together to get superior performance across the image at a single ISO of 1000, giving you, greater highlight, latitude, and superior performance in the shadows. So you might hear me interchangeably describing this mode as dynamic range expansion, just because it's a bit confusing, so I apologize for that. But essentially, it's achieving the same thing. It's increasing the dynamic range at the cost of rolling shutter. It's just using a slightly different technique than the S1R Mark II, and it's the same technique that's also employed on the GH line, so I think it's also in the GH7. So as you can imagine from a modern Lumix camera, there are a bewildering array of resolutions, codecs, and frame rates. The camera has a 6K sensor, so it tops out at a 3x2 open gate 6K. I think that's in long op, that's what we're recording on now. It tops up to like 30 frames a second, but you can get a downsampled open gate, which is downsampled down to 5.1K open gate. And that's where you can get an H.265 420 25 up to 60 frames a second in a downsampled open gate, which is incredible. It looks fantastic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Cinema 4K up to 120 frames per second, standard 4K 16:9 up to 120 frames. Up to 60 frames, it's a 422 file, and then over to 100 and 120 frames, it's 420. We have the return of ProRes, which is full frame 5.8K 17:9. You can go up to ProRes 422 HQ, and you've also got ProRes RAW, which is a 5.8K file, and that's pixel to pixel crop. But what's interesting in that is because it's pixel to pixel, which means it just crops directly into the sensor, and it's 5.8K. The original sensor is 6K, so it's only something like a 1.03 crop. So you're getting pretty much full frame ProRes RAW from this camera, which is incredible. It does only go up to 30p, so you are a bit limited there. Same with ProRes. As you'd expect, the ProRes RAW looks beautiful, and I've got a whole video out about my workflow on how to get ProRes RAW footage into DaVinci Resolve, so it'll be linked somewhere here. Let's look at some over and under exposure tests on the camera at different ISOs to look at how that dynamic range is distributed. As always, we're exposing for middle grey on a color chart, and then we're using shutter speed to increase or decrease exposure by one-stop increments, and then we're bringing the footage back in post and just normalizing it back to baseline to that middle grey exposure, just to see how far we can push it in terms of overexposing it and underexposing it, and just seeing, you know, where noise creeps in or where the highlights blow out. So first looking at the low base ISO 640, and we're just going up in one stop increments, and we can see it's about 4 stops where we get clipped highlights, but along the way the camera is holding on to colors really well. You could have a usable image at that 4 stops so long as you didn't really have anything too much going on in the high end of that image. As you can see, the colors still look great. Let's look at the high base now, so 5000 ISO. We'll do the same test to bring it up in one stop increments, and interestingly we see kind of like the same performance. You know, sometimes in higher ISOs we expect to get slightly better highlight performance, but when we look at these two together, both 640 and 5000, they seem to clip at the same point. If you look at that polystyrene, the highlights are clipped at 4 stops and then both gone completely at 5 stops. As you'd expect, it's a slightly different story when we go into dynamic range expansion mode, so that's shot at ISO 1000, and as you might expect, we're getting about 1 extra stop of latitude, maybe a little bit more in those overexposure tests. So we can look at dynamic range expansion mode compared to 640 ISO, at 4 stops overexposed, you can see here blown out, and again blown out in the 5000 ISO, whereas the dynamic range extension mode just allows you to retain information in your highlights. Now we're going to underexpose the camera at different ISO levels and just look at what's happening in terms of low light performance and noise performance. We're going to underexpose the camera now. It's 640 ISO, it's very clean. At 3 stops on my monitor, I can see just a hint of noise. It's something that probably wouldn't survive over to YouTube compression. At -4 stops, we are seeing a very subtle green tint or color shift, especially in the shadows. Noise is becoming a little bit more apparent, but it's still very fine. Again, I don't even know if that would survive the compression on YouTube. Now at 5 stops underexposed, we are seeing a slightly more prominent green shift in tinting. Noise is becoming a lot more present in this, but again, it's not what I would say falling apart. There isn't lots of sort of banding or fixed pattern noise, and I think, you know, with the right noise reduction, you could tidy a lot of that up. And as you can see across this range, the camera is really holding on to colors. It's only when you get to -4, -5 that you get sort of subtle color shifts that you could easily grade out. Let's look at the high base now, so ISO 5000, and interestingly we're sort of seeing very similar results here. Again, seeing a slight color shift at -3 and then -4, you know, that's when the image becomes a bit more grainy and noisy. -5 stops, similar thing here, although I would say there seems to be more of a sort of slight red tint in some of the shadows. I don't know if this is just the quality of the noise in this higher base ISO that provides that. And then when you look at the two low base and high base side by side, the noise is maybe a little bit more aggressive in the high base, as you might expect, but still really good performance between the two. So again, let's look at the dynamic range boost mode. So at 4 stops underexposed, we see that slight green tinting, but the image does seem to be maybe a little bit cleaner. The noise is maybe a little bit finer than in the other two. It's kind of interesting that we're seeing variations in tinting at different ISO levels when you underexpose the camera. I wonder if this is something to do with that partially stacked sensor. I want to just quickly stack this up to show you how it compares to the S1R Mark II and the S5 IIX. Even in dynamic range boost mode, the S1R Mark II is already clipped by 4 stops overexposed. On the S1R Mark II, with dynamic range boost mode off, it will clip at around 3 stops overexposed. So you've already got an extra stop of latitude with the S1 Mark II, even with dynamic range boost off. Let's look at the S5 IIX now, and I would say that highlight performance is roughly comparable. The S5 IIX seems to retain highlight information and clip a little bit later than the S1 Mark II. However, obviously you have dynamic range extension mode on the S1 Mark II, and that does sort of change things a little bit, where the S5 IIX is just at the point of clipping and has clipped at some areas on that white polystyrene. The S1 II is not clipping at all. Across the board, factoring in dynamic range expansion mode, we are getting superior highlight performance on the new camera. Let's look at underexposure now. -4 stops. The noise is very prominent now on the S1 Mark II. The S1R Mark II is much cleaner. Maybe the noise pattern is a little bit more unstable on the S1 Mark II, a little bit more sort of shimmery and flickery. I don't think this is the issue that the Nikon Z6 Mark III users have been seeing. Remember, we're 4 stops underexposed, so the actual shot without the corrections in post is almost pitch black. -5 stops underexposed. That's when you see some of the color shifts in the other camera, the S1R Mark II pushes slightly warmer when you underexpose it, interestingly, whereas we're seeing heavy noise, chroma noise, and quite strong green tinting in the S1 Mark II. And the same is true when we look at the high base. The S1R Mark II does outperform the S1 Mark II, but you've also got to bear in mind that the highlight performance on that camera is significantly reduced, which means that you have to underexpose the S1R II anyway, which means that you are probably going to be needing those extra stops of underexposure if you want to retain your highlight information. Let's look at the S5 IIX now. Generally, the S1 Mark II performs better in low light than this older camera. You can see at -4 stops, the S5 IIX is already heavily tinted green and there's a lot of noise. And then when you get to -5 stops underexposed, there's like slimy green discoloration of the whole S5 IIX frame, fixed pattern noise, whereas the S1 II could be salvageable in certain circumstances. The noise in the grain is very fine, whereas S5 IIX is just completely gone and there's a lot of discoloration. Let's look at the high base, so 4,000 for the S5 IIX and 5,000 for the S1 Mark II. -3, there's a lot more noise in the S5 IIX. It's already pushing a little bit green. At -4 stops, I would say that's unusable now on the S5 IIX. A lot of chroma noise, some fixed pattern noise. And then if you go to -5 stops, that S5 IIX image is just completely gone. It's not great on the S1 II, but the degree of noise is much more consistent. You're not really getting that kind of like liney, bandy, fixed pattern noise that shows up on the S5 IIX. In summary, the S1 Mark II kind of borrows the best elements from both of these previous cameras. It continues the great low light performance of the S1R Mark II and takes the highlight performance from the S5 IIX and combines it into this great powerful little camera. And then the other thing to note is that this camera just holds on to colors. So when you are stress testing it across this under and overexposure, it's holding on to the color. It's very accurate with the colors, and it's only at around -4 stops underexposed that you see some light green tinting in the low base and maybe some light sort of warm tinting in the high base. And as we'll see in the following section, this performance played out really well when I was shooting my documentary.
I have a crush on wood.
When I got to Lisbon with Steph, we had a few days to ourselves for a little mini break. We were staying in this beautiful Airbnb in Lisbon, and the owner, Diogo, as he was checking us in, he mentioned that he worked in a woodworking studio in town, and this got me really interested. So I asked him if we could go film with him later on in the week, and he said yes. So when we got our hands on the S1 Mark II, we broke off from the main group and we went and shot a little documentary at their studio. Big shout out to Gary Scaife, who came and helped me on this. It was a super guerrilla filming project. No tripods, no lights, no extra equipment to shoot this documentary on, and sort of just making it up as we went along. So we were balancing using the natural light available in the location, so positioning our subjects near windows and stuff. And that made for a really challenging shooting environment for a camera, right? Because the studio had overhead strip lights and really bright windows at either end. So we were, working in really high contrast areas, which would really put a camera like this and its dynamic range to test.
Soft wood, hard wood, smelly wood, not smelly wood. Then when you put it in the machine, it smells, and okay, this wood is this, I smell this. It's amazing. I love working with wood.
So the camera handled the exposure really well, but it also handled colors and transitions between those colors really well. And that kind of thickness and color fidelity that we saw on the S1R Mark II, we're seeing it again in this camera. So I was a little bit worried when I was shooting this doc. If I'd gone in there, I think with a camera like the S5 IIX, the images that we came out with would have looked a little bit muddy, definitely very noisy. And when I got the images back on my computer and I was looking through them, I was very pleasantly surprised by what I saw. So the color fidelity was definitely something me and a lot of other reviewers highlighted on the S1R Mark II. I'm glad to say that we're seeing the same sort of colors appear on this camera. Lumix must have upgraded their sort of image processing algorithms or something, because the colors just look fantastic. The low light performance on this camera is also really impressive. So to get slightly more dramatic lighting, I turned all the lights off in this back room and relied on the top down window light coming in from above, as well as a small desk lamp. And the camera handled this scene really well. I was able to shoot also in 50 frames a second and push the ISO to its high base ISO of 5000, which is very clean. So the shadows in this image are definitely underexposed, but even if we push the Rec 709 image by 2 stops in post, we can see that we're still getting a really clean image in that t-shirt. There is a bit of noise creeping in, but it's completely usable. Really impressive that we can really lift that image if we really want to. But what's also cool is that I'm able to capture up to 100 frames a second in this low lit scene, pushing the ISO past that high base of 5000 up to 8000 and even 10,000. As you can see on the log image, the shadows here are very noisy. Remember, the 100 frames a second is also captured in a 420 file. Luckily, we're going to be dragging those shadows right down, and also a tiny bit of noise reduction will help smooth out some of that noise, which means that even in this incredibly challenging low lit scene, when we're pushing the ISO in a lower bitrate file, we're still able to get usable, beautiful footage. Looking at the images from this camera in such a challenging shooting environment, we're getting performance that I'm used to seeing in my Red Komodo. And it does make me wonder whether this camera could replace my Komodo on certain shoots where, I really will be benefiting from all the stuff that Lumix wraps around a camera like this, like the IBIS, the autofocus, the low light performance and stuff like that. With the launch of this camera, we're also seeing big updates to the autofocus system and also a new autofocus mode, urban sports mode. These new improvements and features will also roll out via firmware updates to the S1R Mark II. They'll be inside this camera at launch. For the urban sports mode, part of the launch event, Lumix hired a bunch of breakdancers and BMXers, and from my testing at that event, it works really well. It seems to confidently and intelligently, track the trunks of body and limbs, and just sort of stops the camera from, pulsing and hunting too much whilst you're filming these dynamic scenes. Spent a bit more time with the S1R Mark II over the last few months. I have found the autofocus on that camera to be a little bit inconsistent. I'd say like 75% of the time it is absolutely rock solid, but then you get these occasions where it just frustratingly doesn't seem to work. The frustrating thing is that you don't tend to notice this when you're shooting it, only when you get the camera back and you pick up these sort of shot ruining micro pulses and hunting. So it definitely looks like with the new sensor in S1R Mark II that they had some work to do. So far so good with the S1 Mark II, there doesn't seem to be any issues, and maybe a lot of those issues with the S1R Mark II will be fixed with the rollout of the new autofocus updates. The S1 Mark II seems to be a lot more stable, a lot more reliable. Generally, the tracking behavior and the stability and confidence of the autofocus system in this camera seems to be really solid, even at launch. And, it's amazing to see that Lumix are, even a few months after launch of the S1R Mark II, rolling out further updates to improve the reliability of that. One of the other headline updates with the autofocus system in this camera is its performance in 100 frames, high frame rate shooting. So on the S1R Mark II, when I did my initial video on that, I actually recommend just disabling autofocus in the high frame rates mode. You lose tracking behavior, but whatever autofocus system was being used there just wasn't able to keep up or give you usable results. There was a lot of hunting, a lot of pulsing, stuff that you wouldn't really pick up whilst you were shooting, but when you got it back in post, you would, have a lot of your footage ruined by it. That doesn't seem to be the case now with the S1 Mark II. The high frame rate autofocus is snappy, it's responsive, it's confident, and it just works. And in my testing, even when we're shooting like animals and dogs in the park, although we don't have the sort of tracking behavior and activity, it was still able to keep everything in focus, and is completely usable now. So it's really good to see that LUMIX has improved on that, and hopefully that will be rolled out to the S1R Mark II via firmware update, and it's great to see that that's only taken them a couple of months to fix. Outside of 120 frames per second, you get full autofocus tracking in all resolutions and frame rates up to 60p, so all the way up to 6K 30p, even in 5.1K open gate 60 frames per second, you still get autofocus tracking. The only caveat is that when you plug an HDMI monitor in, you lose autofocus tracking in the higher resolution, higher frame rates. So up to 4K 60 you still maintain tracking, and in all the other resolutions up to 30p you still maintain tracking. But as you go beyond 4K and if you go beyond 30p, so 50-60 frames a second, you will lose autofocus tracking, which is a bit of a shame to see. Full frame open gate up to 60 frames a second. I mean, that's awesome. So I think LUMIX were the first camera manufacturer to give us open gate in a mirrorless body, and now they're pushing the boundaries even more by giving us high frame rate shooting in that open gate mode. With the previous generations of cameras, I never really got into shooting open gate much, a little bit with anamorphic, but I tended to shoot in the Super 35 mode because that unlocked the higher frame rates and also gave you better sensor readout performance. Because we have got this partially stacked sensor in the S1R Mark II, you're no longer having to make that sacrifice with rolling shutter performance when you go into open gate mode. And that just means now that you can shoot full projects and be fully sort of confident that you can shoot full frame anamorphic. You've got your 60p covered, you've got the anamorphic IBIS available now. This really is a fully functional anamorphic beast now. These are features that are lacking from most larger cinema cameras. So with this functionality combined with all the other stuff that LUMIX wraps around the camera, and with the advent of autofocus anamorphic lenses, things are going to get really interesting for people who want to shoot anamorphic on a budget or a small form factor. A lot of the LUMIX people call me Mr. 18mm because I love the 18mm LUMIX S lens. It's one of my favorite lenses, but previously it was unusable with the IBIS system in the previous generations of cameras. With the introduction of Cropless IBIS, it has transformed my use of that lens, and it's good to see that the Cropless IBIS is also tuning up in this camera. It also works great with their new 20-60 zoom lens, so we were using that on a mini dock and throughout the launch event as well. Now, there is obviously still one caveat with the Cropless IBIS in that you can only use it with LUMIX Panasonic Natus lenses. I really want to see Panasonic roll this out to non-native lenses, and I really hope it's not just a cynical attempt to shift more of their own first-party lenses. If they could roll this out so it works on, cine lenses and third-party lenses and adapted lenses, that would be a really killer feature, and it's something that would really benefit LUMIX shooters across the board. Not all of us want to shoot on the sort of clean modern lenses, which LUMIX lenses. I have a lot of cine lenses, and being able to shoot 14mm 18mm wide angle lenses with that cropless IBIS would just be absolutely incredible. So the S1 II can shoot up to 120 frames a second in full frame mode, with the slight caveat that there is a bit of a crop. I think it's a 1.24 times crop. And there is also one other peculiarity in that you can't actually shoot 120 frames in S&Q mode. Now, the reason behind that apparently is because there are processor limitations that mean that the camera can't slow that footage down internally, which is what S&Q mode is for. So you can only shoot those higher frame rates in the standard video shooting mode, and then you'll have to pull it into your editor and slow it down on your own timeline. I didn't think I was going to be bothered by this, but when we were shooting our documentary and we were shooting some sort of really nice slow motion scenes, as you can see here, you just want to show the person you're filming with what the slow motion looks like and also preview it yourself. It's a shame that the camera can't do that. Again, it's not the end of the world, but it is like a small peculiarity that I picked up on this camera. To my eye, the 120 frames per second on this camera looks much nicer than on the S1R Mark II. On the previous camera, I believe it was line skipped or pixel bin from the 8K sensor down to 4K, whereas on this we're getting an oversampled image, so we're not getting any weird artifacting or sort of mushy detail, which I feel was present on the S1R Mark II. Although this is all good news, LUMIX is still kind of lagging behind, you know, when you consider the FX3, a really old 4-year-old camera that has 4K 422 high frame rate recording up to 120, and it also maintains autofocus tracking in the higher frame rate modes, something that this camera and the S1R Mark II are both lacking. We've got a new sensor in this camera, likely to be the same sensor in the Nikon Z6 Mark III. People who have already tested that camera have given readout speeds of around, I think, 8 to 10 milliseconds, so it's very likely we'll be seeing the same performance in this sensor. I'm not really interested in mechanically testing it, I'd rather just shoot something and then just go with my eye whether I like the look of it or not, so that's what I did. At the launch event, we had some breakdancers performing for us, so I just decided to give them the camera and ask them to perform with the camera in their hand and spin around, jump around, that sort of stuff. And as you can see, the footage looks lovely. It has a really organic cadence to it, lovely fluid motion. I guess if you pixel peep or if you're highly sensitive to it, you'll pick it up. But I can't really see myself often shooting in environments faster than a breakdancer spinning around. You know, it's not global shutter performance, but for my use, it's good. There are so many variables that will affect overheating in a camera like this. So whether you use the Metal CF Express Type B cards, the speed of those cards and also the brand of those cards will affect how hot they get, which adds to this sort of like heat budget within the camera. Supplying power over USB, maybe via a V-mount battery, that will add heat to the camera as well. And also just obviously ambient temperatures, the orientation of the flip out screen and stuff like that. And obviously the resolutions and frame rates and codecs. Generally, I'm recording now, it's May in the UK, so ambient temperatures are around 20 to 23, I guess. It's quite warm at the moment, and the camera's been sat on a sunny windowsill, and I've run my tests in a select few modes. I've only had time to do a few, and that's in 6K 3x2 open gate at 25 frames, and then in the open gate, the downsampled 5.1K open gate at 25 frames and at 50 frames a second. I ran the first batch of tests in the default temperature settings on the camera, which I guess a lot of people will be using out of the box, and the only mode that overheated was the 5.1K open gate at 50 frames. It got to around 45 to 50 minutes, and then the warning came on, and soon after it stopped recording. And even when I changed the thermal settings, you know, the tolerance of the camera thermal settings to high and turned fan mode to normal, I got similar results to that. So the good news is that in the other modes, 6K 3x2 25 frames per second, and at 5.1K open gate 25 frames per second, I couldn't get the camera to overheat. Not even the warning came on. 3 to 4 hours of continuous recording, and I just opted to stop the recording. So really good results. So if you are going to be capturing long form interviews on this camera, you know, in standard recording modes and frame rates, I don't think you're going to have any problems of overheating at all. Because there are so many variables, I think it's always wise to take overheating tests with a pinch of salt. Look at all the YouTubers who run these tests and sort of average their results to get a sort of read on how this camera is performing. But from my tests, relative to the S1R Mark II, it does seem to run a lot cooler and have a better tolerance for managing heat. So also at the LUMIX launch event, we got this. It's a new zoom lens. It's a 24 to 60 LUMIX S lens. I think it will be launching at around £800. But more importantly is that you can get it bundled with the S1 Mark II, which I would absolutely recommend doing. I think you get a massive discount on it as well if you buy the two together, maybe like £300, £400. Overall, I absolutely love this thing. I'm surprised at how much I like it. Not really a massive fan of modern stills lenses or even zoom lenses, but this is small enough to make it super useful. It's got great close focus. It's wide enough, which is for me most important on the 24mm end. One of the things that stopped me from buying the Sigma 28 to 70 is that it's just not wide enough for me. Although this doesn't quite go to the same in terms of the long zoom end, you can map this button to use LUMIX's new, whatever it's called, zoom feature, which allows you to extend the reaches of your lenses, you know, by about 10 mil or something. So you can effectively turn this into a 24-70 using that feature, which is great. Image quality so far is really nice. It's not too harsh or sharp. Really nice bokeh and quite a nice organic feel to it, you know, as much as you could expect from a stills lens. The 2.8 is not the fastest lens on the market. It's not really competing with the likes of Sony and Canon. That probably does help keep the size down. It helps keep the cost down. And honestly, I can live with 2.8 if the lens is small and cheap and still looks good. Most of my projects I'm shooting at a T2.8 anyway. I'd love to know what the general interest in this lens would be, whether you think LUMIX is offering you something useful or whether you would have rather have seen something a bit faster. So far, so good. I absolutely love the S1 Mark II. I love the S1R Mark II. It's the camera I've been filming this video on. I've been shooting with it a lot over the last few months. And man, the color fidelity in, you know, this new generation of cameras is just incredible. And there's just a thickness to the image. I love Vlog and the way that these sensors are being used to capture colors and transitions between colors. It's just a huge step up from the last generation of LUMIX cameras. We're getting closer to what I, you know, am used to seeing in my Red Komodo here, especially when you really push these cameras in low light, even in high ISO performance. These cameras just really grab onto colors and they hold on to them. You know, as video shooters, we need a strong 6K. 8K is a gimmick, in my opinion. You know, unless you're doing very specialist types of work, 8K is just overkill, especially in a tiny mirrorless body, which is very like heat and processor bound. So if you need the resolution and you shoot stills and you want to shoot 8K, you've got the choice now. You can go for the S1R Mark II. If you want a sort of a better video experience and you're only interested in up to 6K, the S1 Mark II is such a strong offering at a really sort of reasonable, affordable price. You know, you've got the culmination of everything coming together in this camera. You've got false color, autofocus, open gate, superior IBIS, anamorphic features. The list goes on. Overall, I think this is just a much more attractive package for video shooters. I think it's superior than most of the offerings from Sony at the moment, from Nikon, from Canon, and for the price, I just don't think it can be beat. Obviously, we're yet to see what Sony's next move will be, but I can almost guarantee you that they're not going to be able to match LUMIX on their pricing. And the pressure really is going to be on them to offer something to justify a higher price when you have cameras like this on the market. When you also factor in what's going on with Blackmagic and their releases, there's a lot of pressure now on the market, and this is only a good thing for us consumers to have more competition. Remember, this camera is a tool and it either does or it doesn't allow you to get on and do the job. And in my opinion, this is a really powerful tool and something, you know, I couldn't have imagined getting my hands on 10 years ago at this price point. I think in a lot of situations, the camera is not the thing that limits creativity. I think we've got to a point now where the features that we're cramming in these small cameras are so advanced and available at such a low price. We're really nitpicking now when it comes to comparing two cameras to each other. The S1 Mark II being, you know, LUMIX's main full frame, accessible flagship camera, I am really excited to see what's coming next in terms of a more video centric camera. Stick an optical low pass filter in it, some NDs, XLRs, more mounting points, maybe better cooling, bigger body. I'm happy to pay up to $5,000 for that. Maybe use a fully stacked sensor, similar dynamic range, great sensor readout speed. Panasonic, take my money. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think about this camera in the comments down below. If you're going to buy it, I'm sure I'll probably have some sort of affiliate link, so consider buying it from that. I'll make a little bit of commission and it will help support the days and hours that I've spent making this video. But yeah, thanks a lot. Until next time, I'll see you later.